Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here today at this side event on climate justice. Climate change is a key threat which is being faced by the planet and its people today, if not the most threatening situation that we face today. And to ensure that we are able to address climate risks and the threats that are being faced, building long-term resilience to climate change impacts is vital. And in doing this, it's important that the approaches that we take are just and transformative, and also focused on equity, which is intergenerational and intragenerational. And all these actions that we're looking at need to be at all levels, prioritizing climate justice, both which is global, regional, as well as local and national. To highlight the importance of climate justice and also facilitate a discussion on this thematic area, this side event is organized by the Government of Sri Lanka and its partners in this Asia-Pacific Forum, and thank you very much for being here. Just wanted to give you the layout of how we are going to have this discussion. We'll have two panels, and I will invite the first panelist, the distinguished panelist, to come and sit here. And once the presentations are done, we'll have a second panel, which would be invited to come and sit. So for the first panel, we have Dr. Anil Jaisinghe, Secretary of the Ministry of Environment, who will be giving the welcome speech. Doctor, if you could come and sit here. And then we have Honorable Engineer Nazir Ahmed, who is the Minister of Environment of Sri Lanka, followed by Honorable Ms. Ali Sabri, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Sri Lanka, and Ms. Elizabeth Maruma Mrima, UN Assistant Secretary General of UNEP. So if I may request these speakers to come to the stage here, we can then have the interventions done. Okay, thank you very much. So to open the side event, may I request Dr. Anil Jaisinghe sorry, Dr. Jaisinghe. May I invite Dr. Jaisinghe to come and deliver the welcome speech? Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm sure all of you must be very tired after hectic day's work, and some of you hectic 2 days of work. But this is the all-important forum that Sri Lanka is going to propose. So good evening to all of you. Ayubowan. Honorable Engineer Nazir Ahmed, Minister of Environment, Sri Lanka. Honorable Ali Sabri, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sri Lanka. Honorable Vice President of Islamic Republic of Iran, and all honorable ministers from Asia Pacific, representatives of UN organizations and other development partners, foreign delegates, UNEP team, distinguished participants, youth, ladies and gentlemen. As the Ministry of Environment in Sri Lanka is the national focal point to the United Nations Environment Programme and to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, I am honored and privileged to welcome all of you to the side event on climate justice organized by Sri Lanka. In this respect, Sri Lanka is pushing, I warmly welcome Engineer Nazir Ahmed, Honorable Minister of Environment, Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Ali Sabri, the other honorable ministers of Asia Pacific, and UNEP delegates, all ladies and gentlemen, I warmly welcome you to this all-important session. As the Secretary of the Ministry of Environment, Sri Lanka, I always convince myself being in the right place at the right time, and importantly, taking the advantage of opportunities to manage the environment. The special attention given to the environment sector by the Honorable President Ranil Wickremesinghe is a gifted opportunity for us Sri Lankans to forge ahead with climate change action. As you are aware, the whole world is severely affected by adverse impacts of climate change. Of course, our Honorable Minister, Mr. Nazir Ahmed, is a champion in this area. So, he had brief interventions, meetings with Honorable Ministers, and he'll be dealing with the subject after a while. Under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, there are decisions and commitments to address the threat posed by climate change, urging all countries to fully implement them. The UNFCCC and its Paris Agreement clearly spelled out the obligations of the developed countries with regard to provision of support to those of the most vulnerable countries to climate change to build their resilience and other climate actions. However, these obligations remain yet to be sufficiently met, which points for the need for collective efforts to ensure that sufficient support and means of implementation are provided and accessed by climate vulnerable developing countries. I would like to highlight at COP27 held in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt in 2022, parties have taken a historical decision to establish a loss and damage fund, decision on new collective quantified goals on climate finance, and decision on doubling climate finance for adaptation. Therefore, it is imperative that these decisions are implemented. In this respect, Sri Lanka is pushing for a high-level political advocacy initiative that involves the collective efforts of the countries, including developing and like-minded countries which need the support, encouragement, and blessings of all concerned development partners and international agencies to address climate justice through a coalition. Ladies and gentlemen, the objective of this side event is to make Asia-Pacific countries aware of Sri Lanka's initiative for raising a collective voice against the climate injustice. In this, your kind understanding of the proposed initiative is of paramount importance, as in the end, the parties to the Paris Agreement are the compass showing the direction to where to sail. Further, I would like to request the parties to support the resolution on climate justice that will be submitted to UNIA 6 by Sri Lanka. And I seek your support and early commitment to table the resolution at UNIA 6. Also, we invite countries to come forward to submit it jointly. I am happy to announce that Sri Lanka is having a pavilion at upcoming COP28. Sri Lanka is planning to launch a climate justice forum at our country pavilion. There, Sri Lanka expects your participation as well as become a partner, a member to the Climate Justice Forum. Finally, I wish to emphasize that fruitful discussions and inputs captured throughout this side event would be very important for forming an alliance. Without your invaluable inputs, we cannot move forward. In fact, this initiative will be formed with collective efforts. Again, I warmly welcome all the dignitaries, delegates, and development partners to the side event on climate justice organized by the Ministry of Environment of Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jaisinghe, for that very informed and informative welcome that has provided a lot of information on what the event is going to be today and what's going to go forward. Now I would like to invite Honorable Engineer Nazir Ahmed, Minister of Environment of Sri Lanka, to provide an introduction to the Climate Justice Forum. Sir, the floor is yours.
Honorable Ali Sabri, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sri Lanka, Her Excellency Ms. Elizabeth Maruma Miriama, UN Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director, UNEP, His Excellency Vice President of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Honorable Ministers, Heads of Delegation of Asia Pacific, Dr. Anil Jayasinghe, Secretary to the Ministry of Environment, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. We are all tired. I told, just before the meeting I came, it was empty. Then I said, generally, any discussion, whatever takes place at the end of the forum, always like this. So don't expect a crowd to be here, people to be here. But surprisingly, it's full of everyone here. Thank you very much. So that shows the keen interest that you all are showing on the subject that we are going to discuss. At the outset, I must convey once again my sincere appreciation to the United Nations Environment Programme for co-organizing the 5th AP Forum in Sri Lanka. This side event on climate justice is organized by the Ministry of Environment with the objective of deriving the interest of the climate vulnerable and developing nations, not just in the Asia Pacific, but in the whole of the global south. There is an absolute necessity for a united voice for the global south, including all small islands, developing states, for catalyzing concrete actions and results in order to avert a climate apocalypse. I was shocked to hear when Tuvalu Minister, when he addressed the forum, when he addressed the last speech that we had to give, and he was very emotional. And at the end, the appeal he made that his country is going to drown. And what are we going to do? I did not have any answer as the chair when he addressed the chair to tell him the whole world will be behind you to solve your problem, to rescue. But we were not in a position to say that. And there are so many other countries to follow. That is the reality. Unless we wake up now and come together and not only talk loudly, but to tell that these developed countries to take this very seriously and implement those programs and projects and whatever they have planted or written in the form of that has to be implemented on the ground. Unless that happens, there will be many other Tuvalus. We regret and despair to acknowledge that the collective political will in the global north is still far from the threshold and critical mass necessary for pursuing development models that implement sustainable, inclusive, and just transitions globally by scaling up financing from all sources for accelerating progress on the SDGs. some 3.3 billion people, almost half of humanity, live in countries that spend more on debt interest payments than on education or health. The weight of debt compromises developing countries' ability to respond to emergencies, address climate change, and invest in sustainable development. Sri Lanka firmly believes that it is vital that the like-minded climate vulnerable and developing countries should join hands in the increasing global call for greater climate justice and to rally around the effect of formation of Climate Justice Forum in the larger interest of fast-tracking global climate action. Having passed the midpoint of our journey to 2030, the global progress on SDGs is off track with only 12% of the targets on track, an alarming assessment recognized by the recently adopted G20 declaration. We have taken into cognizance that in their recently adopted declaration in New Delhi, G20 leaders acknowledged in no uncertain terms the need of USD 5.8 to 5.9 trillion per year in the pre-2030 period required for developing countries, in particular for their need to implement their NDCs, as well as the need of USD 4 trillion per year for clean energy technologies by 2030 to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Much to our consternation, USD 603 billion a year actually deployed climate finance across the whole world is anemic by itself, and out of which only a fraction is going to developing countries. Globally, climate finance must rise eightfold to meet the estimated 5 trillion needed annually at a minimum for climate action by 2030. Apart from the loss and damage fund being too little, too late, the main challenges that will delay the effective operationalization of the fund includes ambiguity about the definition of the term loss and damage. Still, there is an ambiguity. That is the status. Methodologies to evaluate the damage. If they want to find any equation that they can find very easily. But for this, it's very difficult to find any methodologies. Origin of the money, it is still unclear where the money will come from. The role of financial institutions in the wake of many non-state actors, including private financial institutions, playing a key role in the newly established loss and damage fund. The question of adequacy of the annual contribution of $100 billion when the cost of climate-related disasters are estimated to be at $520 billion a year at a bare minimum. Methodological concerns arising out of the persistent failure to reach the yearly target. Honoring equity and fair share, for instance, the fair share assessment for the US's international climate finance contribution is estimated to be $800 billion between 2021 to 2030, equally split amongst finance for adaptation, mitigation, and addressing loss and damage. This is a far cry from the $4.4 billion in tracked international finance provided by the US. Therefore, looking beyond COP27, the loss and damage fund's near-term success will depend on effectively resolving these challenges. We are profoundly disappointed by the never-ending clash between geopolitical and ecological priorities, impeding reforms to the international financial architecture, without which the following goals that are key to the achieving the UN SDGs shall remain elusive. Making the international financial system more inclusive, providing greater liquidity in times of crisis, and expanding contingency finance, and massively scaling up affordable long-term financing. It is in this context the government of Sri Lanka calls for global climate justice to be mainstreamed into the climate negotiation process. Sri Lanka proposes that in order to address the climate and debt crisis, wealthy governments such as the G20 and key institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and World Bank urgently need to provide debt cancellation for all global South countries that need it across all creditors, including ensuring that private creditors take part to free up resources for climate action and other national needs, and to ensure that countries are not trapped in fossil fuel and other extractive sectors. It's very simple. Rather than talking about all these formulas, if they can say that they are going to slash 5% of debt components and put the condition for that country to implement those funds or use those funds only for ecological projects, eco-friendly project. It's a very simple. For a country like Sri Lanka, we have $52 billion debt. And if they won't, they could say, okay, take 10%, give you financial debt cancellation / of 10% of your debt, but prove yourself. Put that fund. Put the condition, whatever the conditions you want. And put the mechanism to monitor it. We don't need any formula. Provide debt cancellation, cancel debt when climate extreme events strike. Suspend and cancel debt payments when a climate extreme event takes place, so countries have the resources they need for emergency response and reconstruction without going into more debt. Very simple. Any calamity strikes, tell us, rather than, you see, in our country, for example, take Sri Lanka, even for us to estimate, it takes ages. By the time the people have lost their lives, livelihoods, and everything. So tell us, just cancel or ask us to use 1% of the debt component. Then you work out your mathematics, how much it is. So the country is served, people served from the calamity. Provide significantly more better quality, new and additional grant-based climate finance. What do we get now? We get, whether we call it mitigation, adaptation fund, whatever, but we get more debt component, loan component, than grant. What we are proposing, if you are genuinely interested, give us more grant component and reduce the debt component. Why are you burdening with more debts? And to ensure that we are dependent on you. Reverting to my earlier speech today, members of the proposed CJF should deploy their collective political will to establish a new 100% climate finance and green transition focused MDB for the Global South named Biosphere Reserve Bank. The principles, premises, and operational parameters of the proposed Biosphere Reserve Bank are, but not limited to: A, predominantly equity-based development bank, sharing risks and rewards with stakeholders. By prioritizing equity over debt, development partners and the Biosphere Reserve Bank can avoid adding to the sovereign debt burdens of developing countries. In 2019-2020, over 60% of climate finance entailed borrowing funds, or around $384 billion. Only $47 billion came with low-cost or concessional interest rates. No-cost grant finance was only $36 billion. This climate impact, I can just give you one simple example what happened in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka had to go through a flood in 2016 and 17. That cost us 212 deaths, 78 persons missing, more than $1 billion loss. Do you think a country like Sri Lanka can afford to take that burden? What have you done? Not a single cent we received. Use of other innovations blended finance instruments, such as green bonds and credit enhancement facilities and other tools cited in relevant discussion papers from the IMF and proposed by climate finance experts. C, use of conventional interest-based debt instruments and microfinance tools with soft terms for debtors in the SME sectors and cottage industries at the grassroots level, integrating them with the goals of green transition, with full insurance coverage against loss and damage caused by climate hazards. D, use of grants for ecological restoration projects that do not generate revenues but contribute to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreements and the UN SDGs. E, use of equity instruments for implementing gigascale revenue-generating green transition projects under private-public partnership model. Use of equity instruments and debt nature swaps for sovereign debt purchase, cancellation, concession, and reduction for climate vulnerable and developing countries. Before I conclude, I just want to tell you what is happening now. We do get this finance. In order for us to get this margin number, even to get $2 billion funding, maybe we had to work for 2-3 years and waste almost the entire energy of the institutions. And it comes with so much of conditions and more loan components. That is the reality. Do you think a farmer on the street can borrow any finance for the actual eco-friendly project, and whether that fund is accessible for him? No. So that is why the Biosphere Reserve Bank. It has to be accessed. There must be an access for every nook and corner of the earth. Every person on earth should be accessible for that fund, whoever is willing to do eco-friendly project. Then only we can preserve, we can achieve whatever the goals that you have agreed upon. So with that note, I would like to extend my appreciations to the countries that have already agreed and extended their commitments to join hands in this endeavor. I must congratulate them myself. Thank you. I must tell you country by country, but let us get all the commitments, hopefully. You have given us a lot of energy and strength in taking things forward. Therefore, let us come together and take the concepts discussed at this forum to the next level, so that we can achieve the required outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Minister of Environment, for highlighting the need for collective action towards climate justice, as well as the need for means of implementation to address the vulnerabilities and building long-term resilience, especially in those countries that are highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Now, I would like to invite Honorable Mr. Ali Sabri, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Sri Lanka, who would speak to you on climate justice as well as the foreign policy. Thank you.
I know I'll be very brief. Just to put it in perspective, my dear friend, Engineer Nazir Ahmed, Minister of Environment, the champion of this course, Secretary and Assistant Secretary General of the UN, Honorable Your Excellency, Vice President of the Iranian government, Honorable Ministers, ladies and gentlemen. My whole presentation could be summarized in three small sayings. One is our President wound up his speech to the UN this time, saying that it's remarkable to see so much of solidarity in words. When are we going to see that solidarity in action? Because everybody agreed climate change has to be tackled. A lot of things have been written, agreements are signed, but on the ground nothing happens. Second one, no one is safe until everyone is safe. You saw that in the pandemic. Some of the countries thought, we will quickly prepare a good vaccine that will guard us. But you know, when you vaccine them, a new variant came in. So then they realized, until everyone is safe, no one is safe. Third most important thing is also a similar thing. If you walk alone, you can walk fast. But if you walk together, you can walk far. So this is the ideal. Idea is, I'm not going to talk about climate change. You know about it so well. I must learn from you. Idea is, everybody knows the problem. Everybody knows the solution. Problem is how to navigate towards the solution which everybody knows. For that, we need to get together, work together. If one person speaks, somebody will listen, but the weight is not there. So that is why it has to become, we all know, we all talk about triple planetary crisis. Yes, but we also have a massive crisis, similar. The crisis is climate change, crisis on debt, global debt, crisis on food security. These all are interconnected. So in order to overcome that, Sri Lanka acknowledges climate change and the environmental protection as the key priority areas of our foreign policy. Our climate change and environmental diplomacy desires to achieve economic growth, energy security, food security, and conserve nature for a healthy planet. Strengthening the ability to achieve the enhanced adaptability and resilience on the challenges posed by the climate change will contribute towards the overall health and prosperity of the people of Sri Lanka. Exceedingly, climate change is not merely an environmental issue. Ironically, it has evolved into a multifaceted issue of both justice and foreign policy that knows no geographical boundaries, extending its influence to every corner of our planet. The impact is particularly severe on vulnerable communities, economies, livelihood, and ecosystem, amplifying the urgency of collective, well-coordinated action. In many regions of the global south, the effects of climate change are acutely felt, threatening the progress and well-being of the society. To address this challenge, we must recognize the intricate relationship between climate change, justice, and foreign policy. I'm here because of why we should adopt this into foreign policy. A comprehensive approach to foreign policy should integrate climate consideration into conflict resolution, humanitarian aid, and sustainable development efforts. Climate justice demands that we address the disparities of the consequences of climate change. Developing nations which have contributed to the least of the global emission often bear the burden of effect. It is the moral obligation of the international community to stand in solidarity with vulnerable nations and ensure they have resources to support necessary to adapt and mitigate the impact of climate change. We just don't need any longer lectures, directives, best practices. We all know that. We want practical way to achieve it. That's what we are asking for. That's what we are looking for. It is in this regard, I wish to share the recent initiative and commitment made by our President, Honorable Ranil Wickremesinghe, during the COP27 World Leaders Summit, which provided the country a direction on the agenda of climate change. Realizing the importance of the issue attached to the climate change and the slothful progress in the implementation decisions agreed at the UNFCCC summit, President Wickremesinghe articulated delicately lackluster commitment by the developed countries in fulfilling their pledge and highlighted the requirement of a fast-track program to achieve the climate change-related goals. We urge the international community to hold developed nations accountable for their commitment, ensuring that they fulfill their obligation without delay. It is in that sense, establishing a climate justice forum, Sri Lanka anticipates. To foster international collaboration to address climate-related issues such as loss and damage, adaptation, mitigation, and capacity building. By promoting climate justice as a core principle, Sri Lanka aims to ensure that the transition to a low-carbon, sustainable future benefits all segments of the society and helps build resilience in the face of climate change impacts. In conclusion, I must say, my ministry will actively engage in promoting international cooperation and play a lead role in bilateral and multilateral negotiation in climate change and environmental protection with the assistance of the Ministry of Environmental and other climate change agencies of the ministry, including the Presidential Secretariat Climate Change Office. Sri Lanka's foreign policy will stand in advancing objective of Climate Justice Forum. We will stand in solidarity with all nations, especially the most vulnerable, in our collective endeavor to combat climate change. Together we can build a resilience and foster fair, equitable, and sustainable world for future generations. So ultimately what we are asking you, let's work together, put the people to come out with actions, not the words, and let us build a world which is good for the global north as well as the global south. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Minister, for highlighting Sri Lanka's initiatives as well as the work towards the Climate Justice Forum and the integration of climate justice as part of the foreign policy. Now I would like to invite Ms. Elizabeth Maruma-Mrima, who is the UN Assistant Secretary General as well as the Deputy Executive Director of UNEP. She will be speaking about UNEP's initiatives related to climate justice.
Thank you very much, Excellencies. Minister for Environment of Sri Lanka and Minister for Foreign Affairs, the Vice President of Iran, distinguished ministers, Excellencies. We are discussing this evening an important subject matter, climate justice. In the last few days, we've been talking a lot with regards to issues related to climate connected, interconnected with other planetary crises, pollution, biodiversity, loss, and the like. But at the end of the tail of all that, where does justice lie? And I think this is the issue we are discussing. and delighted that the government of Sri Lanka is taking that leadership role to really get not just here at the region, this regional forum, but globally to understand the impacts of climate and what they mean to the justice, particularly of those vulnerable groups and those countries who contributed the least to the changes in climate we are seeing today and suffering the most. So it is that important that it is coming at the right moment. And this is the important topic also when later the climate COP later this year will be discussing the governance structure and the criteria and all those aspects related to the loss and damage fund, which was established last year. Because again, will justice be fair, particularly to those countries who would have suffered most and contributed the least? And that will be a testing ground with the loss and damage fund. And for this region, clearly, climate justice is a complex issue and is characterized by the range of challenges and concerns which the region is already facing. We know that climate change has affected and is continuing to affect every corner of this globe, both in terms of its impact, which are not distributed equally across. And the high reliance in this region, reliance in terms of economies and livelihood on natural resources, makes the region even uniquely vulnerable to climate-related challenges. And we know climate-induced extreme weather events, threats posed by sea level rise to low-lying coastal areas are a key concern for the region. We also know island nations like the Maldives, Tuvalu, Kiribati, already experiencing the harsh realities of the adverse impacts, including displacement. We also know vulnerable communities often lack the resources needed for them to prepare and recover for such disasters, further amplifying the injustices that they face. Women, children, who play a central role, particularly now women in agriculture in many parts of this region, clearly are disproportionately affected, further deepening the gender inequality. Climate-related loss and damage, including the destruction of homes, infrastructure, livelihood, increase that significance issues in this region. And as I said, last year, of course, new funding arrangements and a fund to assist developing countries was set up. It is hoped that this fund will be able to support particularly those vulnerable societies suffering from the adverse effects of climate change, including that loss and damage. But it is also important for the countries in this region to be ready and to be prepared in terms of what methodologies will be used to assess the loss and to assess the damage and what level of compensation could be asked. There need to be a criteria, a certain methodology, which will be used as the basis to justify accessibility to those funds. So there is also homework from the countries to be able to get ready to justify how they have assessed the loss and damages. So that's one. But we also know that issues around climate justice, while we are making progress, the efforts are not even, or they are uneven. The current global efforts to address climate change are mostly guided by the Paris Agreement, which was adopted way back in 2015. But procedural justice, particularly that is the participation in decision-making, have significant steps forward, but implementation of the decisions still depends on the willingness of the nations. So climate financing, such as the Green Climate Fund, continues to play a vital role in supporting the vulnerable communities in the region. And adequate funding, restructuring of funding arrangement, as have been well alluded by the Minister for Environment, will be important to support developing countries to access funds to be able to build the resilience and to transition to sustainable practices. But let's look at climate law or climate rule of law, or the rule of law which is prerequisite for climate justice. Because we know that the rule of law is what will provide the foundations for environmental rights and obligations to be exercised, will be the basis for improving the environmental governance, and those are the laws which will enable access to climate justice. For instance, provisions related to public interest litigation with environmental or climate protection laws need to be in place, effectively enforced for the people, for the societies to be able to access the justice expected. And the effective rule of law will ensure that the procedural access rights, including access to climate justice, can be realized. It is those laws, environmental justice in this case, which will seek to address inequalities within all environmental and climate action. It is that environmental justice that will require actions and solutions that are grounded in human rights, equality, non-discrimination, and include participation of those mostly affected. So without that rule of law and enforcement of those legal rights and obligations, climate governance, access to justice may end up being subjective and unpredictable. So climate justice principles such as intergenerational equity, precautionary principles, free, prior, and informed consent, preventative approach are all found in many of our environmental laws as well as international environmental agreements, for which climate justice is one of those. So we know there are these results of many important global regional consensus building around climate matters, defining the common goals to advance both rule of law, human rights-based approach, decision-making participation will be key equally for climate justice. And we need also to address the barriers to achieving climate justice and protecting the civic space. We need access to justice, which includes access to competent legal redress, competent legal professions to be able to address the complexities of climate cases. Resources and networks for lawyers and judges that are needed to enhance the knowledge and skills for climate law and climate science, and thus leading to climate justice. Citizens, groups involved in seeking remedies, in defending the rights linked to climate impacts and environmental degradation, needed to be in place to avoid harassment, criminalization, or violence. We have seen children, we have seen the youth going to court now seeking climate justice to exercise their rights. But that enabling environment needed to be created and be in place. So we need to create that space for human rights advocates, because lack of protection against those rights can result into grave violation of the fundamental rights of life, health, security, as well as the necessary freedom, as have been underlined recently with the UN General Assembly resolution on the rights to clean and health and sustainable environment. But climate justice also demands ensuring inclusion at all levels, because we know the effects of biodiversity loss, of pollution, of climate change continue to affect disproportionately on certain groups of population: the women, the children and youth, indigenous peoples and local communities, all are adversely affected. So it is that climate justice, which includes issues of distributive justice and disproportionate impacts of planetary crisis on children, on youth, and future, these are future generations, will need to be secured. Intergenerational and intragenerational equity need to be taken into consideration, because these are issues, yes, climate justice, but climate justice related to access to land, access to territories, resources, impacts on culture and traditional knowledge, which all need to be secured. So consultations of all those affected in society, their participation in all decisions that affect them, including their right to clean, health, and sustainable environment. And support from us, the international organizations, to ensure inclusion of civil society, all stakeholders in environmental decision-making, access to information, and effective remedies for climate justice. We will be there to support all, just as we support the governments. And therefore, the voice of the women, the voice of the youth are all important for the adherence to climate justice. And all these, of course, need to build and support capacity for all these stakeholders, the vulnerable groups, the vulnerable societies, for them to be able also to benefit from that sustainable, positive climate justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mrema, for that very informative intervention, highlighting why COP28 is very important for developing countries, especially in mobilizing loss and damage finance, looking at gender-responsive approaches, as well as equity as a key component of climate justice. So I would now like to thank the panelists of the first session, and thank you very much. I would request you to sit in the front rows while I invite the next speakers to kindly come to the panel here. So we have 5 speakers. His Excellency Mr. Ali Salah Jegre, Vice President of the Islamic Republic of Iran. His Excellency Mr. Birendra Prasad Mahato, Minister of Forests and Environment of Nepal. His Excellency Mr. Stephen Victor, Minister of Agriculture, Fisheries and Environment of Palau. His Excellency Ms. Habibun Nahar, Deputy Minister of Environment, Forest and Climate Change for Bangladesh. His Excellency Sang Yoon Lim, Vice Minister, Minister of Environment, Republic of Korea. If I may have, could you please come to the, thank you. Okay, so we would have interventions. You may choose to sit at the panel or come to the podium. It's up to you. We will go in the same order that I announced the speakers, and I would now like to request His Excellency, the Vice President of the Islamic Republic of Iran, to make his speech. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. In the name of God, ministers and distinguished officials, ladies and gentlemen, currently climate change stands as a prominent global challenge affecting countries worldwide. Its impacts and resulting damage transcend borders, impacting nations differently based on their economic structure and geographical conditions. Consequently, the threats posed by this phenomenon don't confine themselves to any specific country or region. In particular, the arid and semi-arid regions of West Asia and the Middle East, with their strategic significance and abundant energy resources, have drawn to attention of world powers. This has led to foreign intervention in past decades, resulting in increased armed conflicts, occupation, and instability within the region. However, the impending challenge that promises to introduce new dimensions of adversity is the dimensioning water resources brought about by climate change. These changes have profound consequences across all aspects of socio-ecological systems. The question that arises is how to address these challenges and who should bear the responsibility for finding solutions. While it is commonly asserted that all nations must combat climate change, it is evident that countries differ significantly in their capacity, abilities, and responsibilities in this regard. Referring to the explicit text of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, it is clear that developed countries carry a historical responsibility for the current state of affairs. The Paris Agreement reinforces this principle, making it the primary responsibility of developed nations to provide financial resources and technology transfer to developing countries. In this vein, it was anticipated that a sustainable sum of 100 billion would be allocated to aid developing nations. Regrettably, despite the passage of time since the approval of this commitment and the promise made by developed countries, little progress has been made, and there have been attempts to evade obligations and shift to the burden onto developing nations. On the flip side, developing countries are more susceptible to the impacts of climate change for several reasons. These include their limited access to financial, technical, and technological resources, as well as their lower capacity to address these challenges. Furthermore, they often find themselves subject to decisions and stringent measures imposed by developed countries outside the framework of international obligations. Consequently, they face more significant constraints in addressing climate-related issues. Additionally, the political approaches of some developed countries, which involve imposing unilateral sanctions on certain nations, including the Islamic Republic of Iran, exacerbate inequality within developing countries. To provide a fair assessment is crucial to recognize that developing nations historically exploited and colonized by major powers and developed countries still require decades of development and progress. Millions of people around the world continue to lack access to their basic rights, including their right to development, clean water, basic energy source, healthcare, and education. Notably, the highest utilization of natural resources, consumption, and environmental impact worldwide is attributed to developed countries. In discussions concerning vulnerability, Iran faces the dual challenge of climate change consequences and the adverse effects of sanctions, which are in turn influenced by political and geopolitical conflicts among global superpowers. These issues significantly hamper Iran's ability to address environmental concerns and respond effectively to climate change. Despite the recommended solution for reducing carbon production and emissions and mitigation climate change through practices such as energy conservation, green transportation, renewable energy utilization, and carbon capture and storage, there is a clear need to establish essential and transparent financial infrastructure. This infrastructure should legally support the implementation of viable plans until positive conditions are met and sustained. The Islamic Republic of Iran, as a signatory to Framework Convention of Climate Change, has consistently supported international efforts aimed at environmental protection, greenhouse gas emission reduction, and climate change adaptation. However, the harsh sanctions have restricted Iran's participation in international scientific and technological collaboration related to the environment. Nonetheless, Iranian knowledge-based companies have not remained passive in the face of these unilateral sanctions. They have actively engaged in research, development, and innovation, harnessing their knowledge and technical capability to address environmental challenges. This proactive approach has enabled them to make significant progress in solving environmental issues while fostering development. It is essential to highlight Iran's readiness to share these accomplishments and experiences, emphasizing its commitment to serious collaboration with other Asia-Pacific Group member countries. This cooperation aims to enhance the environmental conditions within the region. In conclusion, we express the hope for a world characterized by peace, devoid of sanctions, and dedicated to environmental preservation for all. We call upon developed countries to fulfill their obligations in providing funding and technology transfer to all designated developing nations free from political consideration and difference. This commitment to develop serves as the foundation for strengthening cooperation and advancing critical initiatives in environmental protection and climate justice. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, His Excellency, the Vice President of the Islamic Republic of Iran, for that intervention. Now I would like to invite His Excellency, Mr. Birendra Prasad Mahato, to deliver his intervention.
honorable ministers, senior government officials, international delegates and development partners, heads and representatives. Please kindly accept my greetings. First of all, I am thankful to the government of Sri Lanka for inviting me to this side event, which is not only relevant to Sri Lanka and neighboring countries, but this issue is climate justice is equally important to all other countries across the globe which face the same sort of problems that we have been facing for long. Yes, it is true that at present climate change related problems severe and pose a threat to all. Irrespective of this stage of the development at which any individual country stands, but due to an imbalance in the level of social development, economic well-being of the people and society, the economic condition of these countries is affects differently. The extreme events of climate change are becoming more frequent and intense in the region. The devastating flood event of 2022 in Pakistan, the disaster in Melamchi in 2021 in Nepal, and flood events in the states of Uttarakhand and Himachal in North India are a few examples. Unfortunately, the country and society which all consumed less global resources could not develop technological and financial capacity, became satisfied to fulfill their needs with whatever they had, become more at risk to climate change, and now finding difficulties to serving their existing, whereas those who consumed more to support their luxury and capture the market of resources and products are less at risk. In such a situation, demand of justice become the received responsibility of all. Excellency, justice can never become without a struggle. We can take lesson from our history. Unity of the affected and fallen in justice is important to raise our voice on the global platform. The historical responsibility of climate change is not equal to all, as people are differently affected by climate change, and the capacity of bear the burdens of climate change is not the same for all. In such a situation, the importance of climate justice becomes high. Ignoring justice may cause a further increase in the inability of the community and country to fight against climate change and would lead towards more risks. And finally, security is life, food, and water may be at risk. It is not the early to raise our voice in the incoming season of climate change, COP, and UN Environmental Assembly. It is our duty to bring the agenda to the next level. Wishing the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Minister Minister for Forest and Environment of Nepal for that intervention. Now, I would like to request the Honorable Minister of Agriculture, Fisheries and Environment for Palau to take the floor.
Good evening, Excellencies, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, and especially good evening to the youths who are present here this evening. Let me first thank the government of Sri Lanka for taking on this very important initiative on Climate Justice Forum. I believe we're all here because we no longer doubt that climate change affects all of us. The conversation was very different 2 decades ago when there was a lot of debate about who is causing climate change. I think we now all accept that we are all contributing to climate change. The debate now is who should address it. Those who contribute to it the most, pay the most. Those who are the most vulnerable need to receive their assistance so that they can build their resilience to the impact of climate change. I think this is the global debate that is happening. And I am reminded by what the Honorable Minister from Tuvalu mentioned just before the closing of the ministerial segment. He mentioned to the Honorable Chair that the Chair didn't know where Tuvalu is. So when we talk about climate justice, but yet if we don't know who are the most vulnerable member of our society, then how can we address climate justice? I'm pretty sure if we go out to the street in Sri Lanka, in Palau, or any other country, and we talk about climate justice to an average person on the street, they don't know what it means. They probably don't care what it means. What they care is just to be able to put food on their plate so that they can survive until the next day. So to me, addressing climate justice, we must address the economic inequality that exists within our society today. We must address the inequality for the most vulnerable, especially women and youth, who often do not have a voice at the table. Addressing climate justice requires an inclusive approach. If we're talking about justice, it needs to be inclusive. It's not something that we tell someone that you need to be just. It is something that someone believes that we need to be just to one another because we are all human beings and we care for one another. Whether I'm from Palau, from Sri Lanka, from anywhere, when we see someone on the street, we greet them because we care for one another. How do we translate that into how we have this discourse about climate justice? We're simply speaking to the choir. You're all here because you believe. When we talk about finance, we need to be talking to our finance ministers. Who are the decision makers in terms of where that money goes? We need to talk to multilateral development banks who charges interest rate to the vulnerable communities. Is that just? We need to be talking to the private sectors who are contributing to the challenge we face today on climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. We need to be talking to one another. We drive the demand for products that drives private sector to produce to us. And unless we have this very inclusive dialogue, we will be talking for the next 30 years, and I'm afraid Tuvalu, Marshall Islands, the Maldives will not be around to speak their voice as a nation. So how do we change the way we engage in this dialogue? How do we be more inclusive? How do we bring in the private sector who hold some of the resources that can be unlocked to help address the very challenge we all face today? After all, it faces their grandchildren as well, not just our grandchildren, but their grandchildren as well. So how do we create a platform and a forum for those who we believe are causing and contributing most to the problem to be part of the solution, to engage in a constructive dialogue rather than this approach of pointing fingers at one another, saying you're contributing the most, you pay the most, I'm the most vulnerable, I receive the most. We all have differentiated responsibilities, but I do believe we all have different strengths as nations and as people for how we can contribute to solving the problem. How can we bring everyone together? And how can we be talking to the right audience? We keep talking to one another, but those who we need to influence, change their minds, change how they make decisions, are often not part of these conversations. And so I hope that going forward, we can begin to have a more inclusive, frank, open, but respectful dialogue with one another and with those who we believe are driving the challenge we face today. After all, when we build awareness, we can make the right decision. Unless those who sit at the top of these corporations understand how vulnerable Tuvalu is, they won't move to make the right decision. Is it their fault? Not necessarily, because they don't know. And so we need to help build awareness of where our countries are, how vulnerable our people are, and help build awareness amongst these big corporations. There's only hundreds of those big companies that contribute the most to emissions. So there's only 100 people that we can bring along that helps solve the challenge we face today, and so that we as humanity can continue to drive together and with nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Minister, for highlighting some key elements that would focus on climate justice, especially the inclusion and the participation of different stakeholders. Just a procedural information. So we have 2 interventions, and then we would have the floor open for comments. So if you have any comments and inputs on the part of inclusion and participation, do have those ready. So now I would like to invite Honourable Deputy Minister of Environment, Forest and Climate Change of Bangladesh to take the floor. Madam, the floor is yours.
Honorable Chair, Excellencies, international delegates and development partners, good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for me to be here today alongside fellow leaders, policymakers, and advocates who share our commitment to addressing one of the most pressing challenges of our time, climate change. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the Ministry of Environment, Sri Lanka, for hosting this important side event, which shines a spotlight on climate justice. Climate justice is not just a concept, it's a moral imperative that demands our unwavering attention and action. Distinguished participants, in Bangladesh, we are too familiar with the devastating impacts of climate change. Despite being a national and contribute less than 0.48% of the total global greenhouse gas emissions. We have consistently ranked among the most vulnerable countries in the Global Climate Risk Index. Our people, our livelihoods, and our future are at stake. Yet, amidst these adversities, Bangladesh has achieved remarkable resilience and determination under the visionary leadership of our Honorable Prime Minister, Her Excellency Sheikh Hasina. The government of prioritized climate resilience and sustainable development. Initiatives like the National Adaptation Plan 2023 to 2050, with an estimated cost of $213 billion and the updated National Determined Contribution NDC 2021 reflect our commitments to climate action. The Bangladesh Climate Change Strategy and Action Plans, BCCSAP, soon to be updated, showcases our comprehensive approach to addressing climate change. One of our proudest achievements is the installation of over 6 million solar home systems in off-grid areas, the largest off-grid renewable energies program in the world. We have also embraced large-scale solar projects, solar irrigation pumps, and energy-efficient practices across industries. In parallel, we have implemented the polluters pay principles and introduced a green tax and carbon tax to initiate sustainable practices and reduce emissions. Our commitment to climate justice extends beyond our borders. We recognize that the impacts of climate change are felt most acutely by vulnerable developing countries, especially the least developed countries, LDCs, and small islands nations in the Asia-Pacific region. We firmly believe that public funds from multilateral sources should be precedence over private financing and loans to empower these nations in their journey towards green structural transformations. Moreover, we must heed the latest scientific findings as highlighted in the IPCC AR6 report and the imperative set forth in the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan. Developed and larger emitting countries must take immediate and drastic mitigation actions aiming for a global emission reduction of 43% by 2030 and achieving net zero emission by 2050. It is a collective responsibility and we must hold ourselves accountable to it. In conclusion, as we gather here today, let us remember that climate justice is not just an aspiration, it's a duty, a responsibility, and a moral imperative. Bangladesh stands committed to this cause, and we invite the nations to join us for forging a future that is sustainable, resilient, and just for all. Thank you all. Joy Bangla, Joy Bangabandhu.
Thank you, Madam, for that intervention. Now we have the final speaker of this session, who is the Vice Minister for Environment for the Republic of Korea. So, if you may.
Honorable Ministers, distinguished guests, since I'm the last speaker of tonight, I better make it short, okay? Everybody getting hungry. All right, many speakers gave us very inspirative opinions for climate justice. I believe the concept of climate justice is pretty much necessary to identify and address the inequality of climate impact among the countries and communities and the generation. We all understand the contradiction that least responsible countries are most affected by the climate change. There are two maps. Maybe you have seen the maps. The first one is carbon emission distribution. They are all red in global north. And the other one is impact of climate change. They are all red in global south, which means it's directly reversed. That means a lot of success and development in global north become the fate of global south. That's a very sad story. I came here in Colombo and met a few delegates from the island country. The conversation with them gave me heavy heart. It's very sad. The climate crisis triggered maybe the largest migration of human history, and a new term has been added to our dictionary, climate refugee. UN, United Nations project maybe 1 billion migrants by 2050. And also at the community level, marginalized groups affected the most, you know that. It's like a hammering the poorest. And the future generation will be affected far worse than our generation if we neglect our duty. Our past and present are sadly littered with injustice, but the future doesn't have to be. So, with a strong sense of responsibility, the Republic of Korea is joining the commitment of the international community to realizing the climate justice and bringing into our climate action. In that sense, I fully welcome Sri Lankan government's proposal to establish Climate Justice Forum at COP28. I hope it will be very helpful for other countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice Minister. And now, as I promised, we are a bit short of time, but we would have some interventions from the floor and comments. And I really respectfully request to have them limited to 1 minute or 1.5 minutes so that we wouldn't be hungry at the end of the interventions. So, okay, 1, 2, I see 2 intervention requests, maybe 1 or 2 more, so we can close the floor. Could you pass the mic there? Okay, 1, 2, 3, okay. 1 second. Okay, we could, the mic is yours, sir, yes. Please introduce yourself prior to making the intervention. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Anthony Tan. I'm from Malaysia. Actually, this is more of a comment. I was at COP18 Doha in 2012, and loss and damage was being championed by the developing world. From my friends from the Philippines, I think you will remember that Typhoon Haiyan had ravaged the Philippines during the COP. People were being buried and photographs were being circulated online. The Filipino chief negotiator actually cried during the plenary, and he was consoled by other negotiators saying that, don't worry, we will do something. And yet, none of the developed countries supported loss and damage. That is until Typhoon Sandy hit the eastern seaboard of the United States. And suddenly there was 50 to 60 billion US dollars in damage in the US, which had to be covered by US and European insurers. Still, it took 10 years for loss and damage fund to be established. Here, I think I have to sound a warning, and this was shared by my friend from Indonesia. We must also be very careful how the loss and damage compensation is paid. We must ensure that loss and damage payments do not legitimize the indefinite extension of business as usual. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That highlights further the importance of looking at COP28 and looking at how the Loss and Damage Fund has climate justice at the core of it. There's the mic. There were 2 requests from the same row. You have the mic, yes, and then pass to that gentleman. Yes,
thank you very much. It is a very great opportunity for me as an indigenous dust to talk in this high-level meeting. And I want to just echo what was mentioned by Honorable Mr. Ahmed. When we are talking about financing, and when some governments are in this level of discussion deciding something, it is directly influence us as grassroots people. And when we talk about financing, it is very notable to know that it has been almost 5 years that there is no there is no program by UNEP in Iran, and not just in Iran, in 10 other countries in Asia, because we are under sanctions. And these sanctions is almost, we can say it as an act of bullying in international level. And we call it unilateral coercive measures. And let's just echo what was mentioned by one of the other guests in that level. Let's walk together to go far. And if the other countries, yes, we are the countries who are affected by sanctions, but we need the other countries in Asia. Otherwise, the countries who are imposing sanctions on us, they do not just listen to us. We need to, the other countries to echo our voice, because we are affecting very badly. It has been about 40 years that we are affecting by sanctions. And in these years, especially in these, in past 5 years, there weren't any financing for local communities, indigenous peoples, small-scale farmers, and other grassroots people who are affected by climate change and the other crises. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you could pass the mic to that gentleman. Yes, thank you.
My name is Buanak Pereira. I'm from Ceylon Today newspaper. It's more of a commentary and a question. As much as because we heard a lot of leaders in the past 3 days speak of holding the global north accountable. And I think it is true, we should hold them accountable. But we should also hold these massive corporates and these fossil fuel companies who work together with the global south accountable too for the worsening of the climate crisis. Because they're not exploiting the rainforests in the global north. They're not exploiting the fisheries in the global north. They're not destroying the reefs in the global north. It's all happening in the global south. So we are I'm sorry, when I say we, I'm speaking for the global south. I believe we are, to a certain extent, facilitating the global north to exploit and increase the destruction of the environment and worsen the climate crisis. So, and on top of that, many countries, some of the countries who are present here also have regressive laws that are threatening the freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and freedom to protest. And how can we empower the youth, the citizens, to hold their representatives accountable when they are the ones who are facilitating the exploitation? Because climate justice cannot be achieved through mere accountability of the north, of the global north, but also it should include the accountability of the developing countries that are facilitating it. So when are we going to hold ourselves accountable? Because we can get all the money we want from the north, but if it's going to we are just going to let companies come here, destroy what we are promising to protect, there's no result. So when are we going to hold ourselves accountable?
Thank you very much. A lot of questions for us to consider while we move to the dinner. Last intervention, anything from anyone? If not, I think, yes. Okay, thank you very much. So it's been a great discussion, intervention, collection, a lot of information, highlighting the inclusive and participatory components of climate justice, partnerships that are needed, as well as policy law that is needed to ensure climate justice, and looking at also COP28, the actions that we can take collectively, and the initiative of the Climate Justice Forum, which is being led by the Sri Lankan government. So I'm Wasta Vijayanayak. I realized I didn't mention my name when we were starting, and it's been an honor moderating this session. I would like to invite all of you to a dinner, gala dinner, that's organized by the government of Sri Lanka. It's outside. Please do have a nice dinner and enjoy the evening. Thank you very much.